Hello, Rocky Ridge. This is chapter 23 of Lunch Money. We're almost done. Best interest of the school. Mrs. Davenport stood up and walked to the front table. Greg couldn't believe how small she looked. Seeing her walking around in a room full of grown-ups, she only looked about half as big as she did at school. But when she began to talk, Mrs. Davenport seemed larger than life. She had always, just like always. She nodded toward Greg and Maura and said, "It was good to hear students from my school speak so clearly and intelligently. And it was good to hear my colleague, Mr. Xenotopoulos, speak as well. He and I have worked together for 12 years now, and I have a great respect for his talent and his love for teaching the profession. But I feel I must add something that he said. I do not read comic books when I was a child, and neither did my brothers or sisters. Comic books were forbidden in our home. We had plenty of things to read, but always books. Real picture books, chapter books, and novels. My mother felt that comic books were cheap and trashy. Those were her exact words. On long car trips, she read aloud to us books like Tom Sawyer and Charlotte's Web and The Swiss Family Robinson. Lots and lots of great books. We were not allowed to watch Saturday morning cartoons at home either. Back then, I thought it was unfair. But by the time I reached college, I felt certain that a childhood without comic books and TV cartoons had been better and richer and not poorer. And as an elementary and intermediate school principal in the past 18 years, I have tried to uphold the highest standards of literacy of our libraries and our classrooms. But before I go on, I have to make a confession. When I arrived home from school late yesterday afternoon, there was a package waiting for me. I didn't know who sent it because there was no mailing label, no return address. When I opened the top of the box, I first discovered this note. Please take a good look. Under the note, this is what I found. Mrs. Davenport walked back to her chair, leaned over, reached into a box and then held up a small stack of comic books. Standing in the aisle and facing the audience, she said, there were 20 or 30 of them in a box. My husband was thrilled because he remembered some of them from when he was a boy. With some encouragement from him, I sat home last night and I read comic books for the first time in my life. And here's my confession. I enjoyed myself. Please don't misunderstand me. Nothing will ever convince me that the three Supermen from Kryptonite or Donald Duck Volcano Valley will ever be called great children's literature. But I am ready to agree that a good comic book can be fun and basically harmless, as Mr. Xenotopoulos said. Greg almost floated up out of his chair. He nudged Maura and whispered, "This is great." But the principal wasn't done. Mrs. Davenport went back to the microphone and paused to look into the faces of the committers. However, I believe we have to think carefully about the question of what gets sold to children at our schools, and especially what children sell to one another. What if a student decides next week that she wants to set up a stand and sell her homemade dolls out by the buses before and after school? Will we give them permission? Or what if a boy decides to bring a baseball card collection to school to see if he can wheel and deal between classes? Try to imagine all the different things that children could dream up to sell to each other. Do we want our school turned into a huge flea market? How can we give permission to this plan and then not accept others? As a principal, it is up to me to make sure that my school continues to be a place of learning, not a place for buying and selling. Greg looked around. A lot of people agreed with what Miss Davenport was just Miss Davenport just said. Mr. Z raised his hand, and then the chairperson nodded at him. And he stood up and said, I agree with everything Miss Davenport said. Schools shouldn't become a place that's about buying and selling. It's partly about buying and selling, and we can pretend it's not. Schools are supposed to prepare kids for a happy, successful life. One important goal of our school system is to turn our graduates who have something to value other than or offer the world skills and talents and abilities that others will eventually pay them for. A math teacher gets paid money for teaching math. A principal gets money for running a school. We all hope our students one day will be paid for their work too. There's certainly nothing wrong with having kids learn about money and economics, profits and percentages. In fact, it would be wrong if we didn't teach them these things, which is why we teach units of economy and consumer education. When Greg and Maura have to offer should help others enjoy reading just like book clubs do. And their comics even go step further because of the micro comics will encourage students' writing and students' work. The regular book companies provide a wholesome service that supports education, and that's why they're allowed to sell books at our school and make a profit. And everyone agrees that it's right to get paid for the work that's well done. These kids are asking for the same privilege. Plus, they're volunteered to donate a percentage of their profits to the school library, which no book club is offered to do. Mrs. Davenport shook her head. I still have trouble with the idea of actually selling things right at school. But that's already happening, Mr. Z said. He turned to Greg and Maura. How many different companies did we find that are advertising or selling things directly to kids at artwork school? Greg said, a lot. Maura nodded and started counting them off on her fingers. There's the Domino's Pizza Day banner in the cafeteria, the Verified Juice machine, the Frito-Lay snack machine, the Powerade machine by the gym door, the Coca-Cola scoreboard by the playing field, and the Nike book covers all of our social studies books. The Mars Candy fundraiser posters in the gym, the Wilson and Spalding and Adidas names on all the sports equipment, and the big IBM letters on every clock in every room in the school. Greg said, and there's a lot of ads on the magazines for kids in our school library, plus all the sports biography books that are like ads for pro sports teams or NASCAR. And sometimes there are morning P announcements about after-school bike sales and Saturday car washes at the high school. And there's a blue sweatshirt, like the Champion logo that Mr. Kellett wears during every gym class, and the Apple logo that's almost every computer. And there's stuff sold at the school store, plus the book clubs. Mr. Z turned to committee members and said, I don't like the way the children are treating the sales targets. I know none of them do either, but we have to face it. Selling to children is big business, and we have to help kids understand this so we can make them so they can make good decisions. I did some research. Do you know how much of their own money American kids in grades kindergarten through 6 spend every year? $13 billion. That's billion with a B. $13 billion of their own money. And that number grows every year. Greg was stunned. $13 billion? A week ago, Greg enjoyed the number. He had let that number slowly absorb his entire mind. He would have let himself dream of grabbing huge chunks of that $13 billion for himself. But tonight, the number struck him differently. Greg saw that the giant plan for Chunky Comics was no longer a tiny speck, an almost invisible atom on the edge of a huge whirling universe of money and products and buying and selling. Kids spent $13 billion last year as a part that year, and part of that was by him. Greg kept careful records. He knew that during the past 12 months he had spent over $4,000 of his own money, the biggest chunk for a new iPod, because I'm a sales target, me and every kid in America. Mr. Z said so. And sitting there in the front of the meeting room, Greg realized that he'd been thinking of the kids at school the same way, as targets. He was a hunter and they were the prey. And what did he want from the school committee? A hunting license. He wanted permission to aim his comic books at every kid in the school. And why? Was it to help kids become better readers? Or for them to get interested in writing and drawing? Not really. Greedy Greg wanted to sell Chunky Comics so he could make money. Mr. Z was still talking. I'm glad that Greg and Maura got to sit through this whole meeting tonight. I'm proud to have them, to see them I'm proud to see how much they care about what goes on in every detail and happens in our school. And I want to see, and I want to see that this is not us against Mrs. Davenport, because that's not the way it works. We all want the same thing, what's best for the school, and what's best for every student. Greg looked at Mrs. Davenport. She was nodding. Greg felt himself nodding too. Mr. Z said, the idea that Greg and Maura have is not some marketing plan that is drawn up by Los Angeles or Minneapolis or New York. It's homegrown. So I say it deserves to support. And whatever the school committee decides, we will be in the right. We will be all right with it, me and Greg and Maura. But only if it's right. If it's all right with Mrs. Davenport too. Because we're all in this together. Mr. Z sat down with Mrs. Davenport and said, I want to thank Mr. Xenotopoulos for the offer to work on this together, and I accept it. And we will wait to hear the decision from the committee. As Mrs. Davenport stood up and walked toward her seat, Maura got up and headed for the back of the room. Greg started to follow, but he stopped. He turned and faced the committee and said, Can I say something else? He asked. The chairperson nodded, and Greg went to the microphone. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say, but he was sure that one thing, that this was his first. He gulped and said, If it's okay, I think I want to sort of change my idea. Greg felt the whole room get very quiet. A woman squinted and looked over the top of her glasses. And, You mean the comic book club? Change it now? Greg gulped again. Yes. Yes. Because what Mrs. Davenport said is right. It's not fair if Maura and I get special permission to sell our comic books and then other kids can't sell things that they tried to make. The man at the front table said, So what are you proposing? Greg said, Well, I think I ought to be like if we... Greg heard himself sputtering and stalling, saying nothing, and he knew why. He didn't really have a new idea, but he felt like something needed to be changed, and he knew it was now or never. From behind him, a voice said, I think Greg's trying to say the school store could be the answer. Greg turned around, and it was Mr. Z. Greg nodded slowly, and then whipped back to face the school committee. Excited now, he said, Yeah, that's right, exactly. It's the school store. And, making it up as he went along, Greg said, Because we already have a store at school in the cafeteria. Except instead of just school supplies, we can sell our comics, and other kids could sell their things too. Because lots of kids have good ideas, and the store could be like a business, a real business. Except any kid who sells stuff at the store has to give 50%. 50% of all the profits go to something that helps the whole school. Because that's the way, half of the profits and half of learning. And that is my new idea, if that's okay. Then Greg stood up, turned around, headed for his seat, and walked past the principal. He glanced at her face. She was smiling, and he smiled back. And she said, Just a moment, Greg. She bent over, picked up a small cardboard box, and held it out to him. The old comic books. I won't be needing these anymore. Greg blushed and started saying something back, but the chairperson was calling for the next speaker. Greg gave the principal an awkward smile, took the box, and hurried back to his chair. As Mrs. Davenport sat down, she couldn't help thinking, He's really a remarkable boy. I'm proud of him. And as Greg sat down with the box of comics in his lap, he couldn't help but thinking, $13 billion.